Hello and welcome to our video presentation.
We are Team 4 in Alexander Cubis's second group, and today we'll be using this presentation to provide a detailed analysis of the rhetorical devices used by two competing advertisements on the Gruen transfer segment, the pitch.
Representing their respective advertising agencies, Vince McSweeney and Andrew Tinning deliver two fundamentally different pitches to the panel and studio audience. They were tasked with producing a 30-second advertisement which would convince ordinary Australians that living near a nuclear reactor wouldn't be such a bad thing. McSweeney attempts to do this by disassociating one's proximity to the reactor from one's proximity to the waste produced by these reactors. Tinning hopes to invert the audience's entire perception of nuclear reactors, hoping they will instead view them as an opportunity to create new landmarks.
Both of these pitches are likely to humour their respective target audiences. Our team decided, however, that it was the second of the two pitches, this one produced by Andrew Tinning, which was the more effective of the two because it was more confident in its ability to engage with its target audience and therefore more likely to evoke a positive and favourable response to the advertiser. It is important, however, to examine the rhetorical tools available to McSweeney and Tinning in the production of their advertisements. Let's first start with tone.
The tone used by both pitches is positive and upbeat. However, McSweeney's is one of assurance, whereas Tinning's is one of triumphalism. McSweeney and Tinning both use a tone which is relevant to the respective angles they took. It should be noted, however, that nuclear reactors and what the judging panel described as a problem product. McSweeney's use of an assuring tone highlighted his decision to accept some of the negative perceptions his target audience might express toward nuclear energy, focusing instead on how all the problems associated with nuclear energy are confined to nuclear waste. Next, we will examine the use of format by McSweeney and Tinning, specifically the use of voice, visuals, and text.
Voiceovers are used in each advertisement, but for differing reasons. McSweeney uses the voiceover to create a knowledgeable authority on the issue of nuclear safety. Voiceover is used to much greater effect by Tinning, who attempts to connect with his target audience as a contemporary of theirs. Both advertisements use visuals to great effect. McSweeney superimposes his central character in front of various identifiable locations, while Tinning renders Australian icons as nuclear reactors. Neither advertisement relies on the use of text to convey their respective messages. McSweeney uses text in the final seconds of his advertisement. The use of the word seriously after the final sell or pitch to his audience shows a lack of conviction and a lack of strength in the argument chosen by McSweeney. We will now look at the target audience of each of these advertisements, as well as how both pitches used irony and preconceived notions to advance their arguments with their respective target audiences.
Both advertisements are clearly aimed at working class, prospective homebuyers with small budgets and limited options. Tinning's ad, however, also targeted tourism operators and property developers, as they, unlike prospective homebuyers, would have the capability of lobbying for a reactor to turn into a landmark, or for all reactors to be shaped as a reactor. McSweeney and Tinning use irony to great effect, challenging the preconceived notions surrounding nuclear safety to great comedic effect. McSweeney has a voiceover list of 3 positive attributes commonly associated with nuclear power, and these are clean, safe, efficient. The audience is then shown bathers in a lake, also being scouted for nuclear waste with 3 nuclear reactors above the lake in the background. Central to any analysis of rhetoric is an examination of the use of logical fallacies. Today, we will look at those found in each of the advertisements.
Both advertisements make appeals to emotion. However, McSweeney makes an appeal to the audience's likely fear of nuclear waste and the related health consequences from exposure to it. This is largely successful in distracting the audience from the dangers of living near a nuclear reactor itself. Tinning appeals to the patriotism of the audience, hoping they will overlook the inherent dangers of living near a nuclear reactor if the nuclear reactors were to look like an iconic Australian landmark. While logical fallacies exist in both advertisements, they are both made at the expense of humour. This strengthens the connection with the target audience and therefore makes both advertisements more persuasive. The 30-second audio-visual advertisement has been the medium of choice for advertisers for decades. We will now focus on the visual arguments made by McSweeney and Tinning in their advertisements.
Both advertisements are heavily reliant on visual arguments. However, they do so with varying degrees of success. In the first third of McSweeney's ad, he seeks to ensure that the viewer feels comfortable by using locations familiar to the target audience. The backdrops of a suburban street, lake, and playground reassure the audience that nothing, apart from the reactors in the background, is out of the ordinary. The familiarity of setting strengthens the position of the voiceover and central character of the ad as the authority on nuclear safety. This is enhanced by his costume, which is a suit and tie at first and a lab coat later on. The next third of McSweeney's ad focuses on the danger associated with the nuclear waste and contrasts the backdrops of foreign locations to the familiar locations used in the first third. Tinning introduces his audience to an identifiable Australian landmark, the Big Banana. Tinning aims to ensure that this landmark becomes a reference point in the audience's mind when they are introduced to nuclear reactors which take the form of other Australian icons. This works well, with the icons becoming increasingly absurd, with the reactors proposed for Nimbin, New South Wales. We will now consider whether or not these arguments would be as effective if they were presented in an essay format.
As we have seen with our previous analysis, both of these advertisements are highly reliant on the audio and visual elements. Both pictures include an overlay of soft classical music, imagery, and visual contrast. These help to persuade the audience, as McSweeney's central argument is based upon the nuclear waste causing harm, and that living next to a nuclear reactor will cause no harm at all, while Tinning mainly aims to change the audience's view on nuclear reactors itself. Therefore, it is highly unlikely that these arguments would be as effective in an essay form due to the comedic setting, which is supported by the powerful use of audio-visual elements. Editing makes a considerable difference as to how the audio-visual product, in this case the advertisement, is viewed. We will now discuss the editing techniques, both used by McSweeney and Tinning.
In both McSweeney and Tinning's arguments, studio audience laughter is used. While this is a positive reaction to the content, this indicates the sarcasm and lack of seriousness displayed through the advertisements. Furthermore, this weakens the authority of the advertisements if viewed as an indirect audience member. We now consider the strength of both McSweeney and Tinning's arguments if they were extended to run for half an hour, which is a common length for serial television programs.
We decided that both pitches in this instance would not be as effective if they were to be 30 minutes long. The first pitch by McSweeney shows signs that it does not take itself too seriously. This certainly limits its ability to persuade, and it would be unlikely that there would be a single member of the audience convinced by its distinction between nuclear reactors and nuclear waste after 30 minutes. The argument of the second pitch, Tinning's, would make it become incredibly boring to see so many Australian icons take the shape of a nuclear reactor, and the initial humour created by this effect would be lost on the audience. Integral to our rhetorical analysis is our examination of the various rhetorical appeals employed by McSweeney and Tinning. We will now examine those.
Neither pitch uses a rhetorical appeal of logos. Both pitches use a rhetorical appeal of pathos. The language choices used by composers affect the audience's emotional response through having a positive influence through the use of humour. McSweeney's pitch stirs a deeply held concerns regarding its exposure to nuclear waste, whereas Tinning's pitch is heavily reliant on the patriotism of the audience. McSweeney's use of ethos is demonstrated through the use of an authoritative figure from Australian Nuclear Energy, who also seems familiar with nuclear science, as he is wearing a cleanroom suit and later on a lab coat. And this makes an appeal to the audience based on his credibility as a voiceover and central character of the advertisement. We will now consider which demographics would be most and least likely to be convinced by the advertisements presented to the audience.
Both McSweeney and Tinning's advertisements are more likely to convince a younger generation, those less educated in the dangers of nuclear power and waste transport, as well as those who have little regard for the environment. Those who would be least convinced by the advertisements of McSweeney and Tinning would be an older generation, maybe those familiar with the Chernobyl disaster and the nuclear waste debates which occurred in the 1980s. Also, those who have lived long enough to know about the worldwide issues caused by nuclear power and any products which can be made through nuclear energy. Finally, we will examine whether or not these advertisements could be as successful abroad.
Both of the pitches have a clear, distinct Australian accent. The first pitch shows an image of Uluru, as well as a typical Queenslander-style home. This indicates that this pitch is targeted specifically towards a domestic audience. In the second pitch, there is a constant reference to Australian landmarks, including the Big Banana, which is then followed with Tinning remodelling the names of other Australian landmarks through the use of alliteration as Killatunk Koalas, Nuclear Ned, plutonium prawns, and so on. Therefore, a foreign and non-Australian audience will struggle to find both these advertisements persuasive. However, they may possibly make them more humorous for a foreign audience.
Our team's analysis has shown that it was Tinning's argument and advertisement which was more effective of the two because it was more confident in its ability to engage with its target audience and therefore more likely to evoke a response favourable to the advertiser, or in this case, the nuclear power lobby. Given the target audience of this ad, a favourable outcome might include town planners allowing more nuclear reactors, property developers buying land near existing nuclear reactors, and prospective property owners buying blocks of land knowing that there is or will be a nuclear reactor nearby. This concludes our team's analysis of a particular episode of the Gruen transfer and the segment The Pitch, where two competing advertising agencies had to convince ordinary Australians that living near a nuclear reactor was a positive thing. We hope you enjoyed our presentation.